Hello there, and a very, very warm welcome to my YouTube. My name's Chris, and I'm taking a look today at an American aviator, Edward Vernon Rickenbacker. He was called America's Ace of Aces during World War One. He was the highest scorer of American aerial victories over the Germans, and he could just as easily have been labelled the luckiest man alive. However, since he survived, by his own count, 135 brushes with death during his exciting lifetime. As it turned out, he started off in car racing, then he moved into aviation, and then post-war he became part owner and a creator of Eastern Airlines. Eddie Rickenbacker is an extraordinary character, so let's take a closer look at him. Edward Vernon Rickenbacker was born in Columbus, Ohio on October the 8th, 1890. He was the son of a Swiss immigrants. He was the third of 8 children. His parents christened him Edward Rickenbacker, but they later added Vernon as his middle name because it sounded classy, and changed the spelling of his last name to Rickenbacker so he would be less Germanic. He answered mostly to the name Rick, but would be best known during his later years as Captain Eddie. His father was a day labourer, and life was not easy for a lad who spoke with an accent that reflected his parents' household language. Engines became young Rickenbacker's passion, and he found a job that changed his life in 1906 when he went to work for Lee Frayer as a race car driver and head of the Frayer-Miller Automobile Co. Frayer liked this scrawny, scrappy lad and let him ride in major races as his mechanic. Rick later went on to work as a salesman for the Columbus Buggy Company, which was then making Firestone Columbus automobiles. He joined automobile designer Fred Duesenberg in 1912 and struck out on his own as a race car driver. He soon established a reputation as a daring driver and won some races, but not without numerous accidents and narrow escapes. After each crash, he would telegraph his mother, telling her not to worry, everything's okay. Although Rickenbacker set a world record speed of 134 miles per hour at Daytona in 1914, he was never able to win the big prize at Indianapolis. While preparing for the Vanderbilt Cup Race in California in November 1916, he had his first ride in an aircraft, flown by Glenn Martin, who was beginning his own career as a pilot and aircraft manufacturer. Young Rickenbacker had a lifelong fear of heights, but he'd not been apprehensive at all during the flight. When America entered the war in 1917, young Rickenbacker volunteered. Despite the fact he was making a reported $40,000 a year at the time, he wanted to learn to fly. But at 27 years of age, he was overage for flight training and no college degree. However, because of his fame as a race car driver, he was sworn in as a sergeant and sailed for Europe as a chauffeur. Contrary to legend, he was not assigned to General John J. Pershing, but did wangle an assignment driving Colonel William Billy Mitchell's flashy twin-six Packard. He pestered Mitchell until he was permitted to apply for flight training, claiming that he was 25, which was the age limit at the time for pilot trainees. After only 17 days as a student pilot, Rick graduated, was commissioned as a lieutenant and assigned to the 94th Aero Squadron under Major John Hofer, based at Gengol Aerodrome near Toul in France, and they were equipped with Newport 28s. It was the American trained fighter squadron that was to draw blood when First Lieutenant Douglas Campbell and Second Lieutenant Alan Winslow brought down a Pfalz D-3A and an Albatross DVA on April the 14th, 1918. Young Rickenbacker was not accepted by the squadron members, mostly Ivy League college graduates. At first they considered him a country bumpkin without any social graces. In fact, he was described by one Yale graduate as a lemon on an orange tree who tended to throw his weight around at the wrong time. Young Rickenbacker was never happier than when he was tinkering with engines rather than socialising. Older than all the others, he was conservative in his flying and had to work hard to overcome a dislike for aerobatics. When he first arrived at the squadron, he was coached by Major Raoul Lufbery, the training officer, but he soon developed his own aerial fighting techniques. He shared a credit with Captain James Norman Hall for his first victory on April the 29th, 1918. He scored his first solo conquest on May the 7th, but it was not confirmed until after the war, when Hall, who'd been shot down and taken prisoner in the same fight, reported the death of Lieutenant Wilhelm Scherer of his captor's unit, Royal Württemberg Jägerstaffel Fighter Squadron 64. As young Rickenbacker's string of victories grew, so did the respect of his squadron mates. The young Rickenbacker from Columbus came home a national hero, but he'd been humbled by the experience, unlike some who glorified in the brief fame they had won. He had no illusions about the durability of being a national hero, saying, "I knew it would be easy to go from hero to zero." Although he was wined and dined from coast to coast and received many offers to endorse commercial products, he refused them all. When a motion picture offered him $100,000 to act in unspecified roles, he declined, although he was by then broke from supporting his family. When young Rickenbacker left active duty, he was promoted to major, but he said, "I felt that my rank of captain was earned and deserved," and he used that title proudly for the rest of his life. Although he wanted to get into some aspect of aviation, he found that the industry was really not ready for him. He believed in its future and made speeches forecasting its unlimited potential. His second career choice was automobile manufacturing, with three well-known automobile executives from the EMF company, Barney Everett, William Metzinger, Walter E. Flanders as backers. Rickenbacker became vice president and director of sales for the Rickenbacker Motor Company. The initial Rickenbacker designs, the first cars to have four-wheel brakes, rolled off the assembly line in Detroit in 1922. In 1926, young Rickenbacker got his first experience in commercial aviation when he and several associates formed Florida Airways. When that venture folded, Eddie Rickenbacker was appointed vice president of General Aviation Corporation, formerly Fokker, followed in 1933 by vice president of North American Aviation and general manager of its subsidiary Eastern Air Transport. Eddie Rickenbacker made national headlines again when President Franklin D. Roosevelt cancelled the commercial airlines' airmail contracts in February 1943 and announced that the Army Air Corps would take over these routes. To show that the airlines were better qualified to fly the mail, Eddie Rickenbacker, with Jack Fry, vice president of TWA, and a contingent of journalists, flew coast to coast in one of the only Douglas DC-1s, granddaddy of all Goonie birds, in 13 hours and 2 minutes. A transcontinental record for commercial planes. It was a public protest against what Eddie Rickenbacker bitterly denounced as legalised murder, since 3 Army pilots had died trying to get to their assigned stations. By February the 26th, 1941, Eddie Rickenbacker's personal luck nearly ran out. He was aboard a DC-3 equipped as a sleeper that smashed into trees on the approach to Atlanta. 11 passengers and the 2 pilots died. For days, Eddie Rickenbacker, badly injured, hovered between life and death, and it took nearly a year before he could get back to work. Some said that it was only Eddie Rickenbacker's cantankerous nature that pulled him through a difficult recovery. Afterwards, he slumped a little and always walked with a slight limp. By the end of 1941, Eastern Airlines was serving 40 cities with 40 DC-3s. There were also 3 Stinson Reliance used for instrument training, and a Kellett autogyro that flew the mail on experimental basis from Philadelphia's main post office to the Camden airport. The advent of World War II drastically changed all the commercial airlines. Eastern Airlines had to give up half its fleet to the military service and took on the task of military cargo airlift, flying Curtiss C-46s to South America and across the South Atlantic to Africa. With the government dictating what the airlines did, Eddie Rickenbacker was only able to stand by and see that Eastern held up its end. As part of Eddie Rickenbacker's duties, when he returned to the States in that October, he was immediately sent to the Pacific to make similar inspection missions, which included taking a memorized verbal message to General Douglas MacArthur from President Roosevelt. He was en route in a Boeing B-17 from Honolulu to Canton Island when the pilot got lost and had to ditch after running out of fuel. One of the 8 men aboard was seriously injured during the ditching. The men retrieved 3 rafts, some survival rations and fishing kits from the sinking bomber, and then roped the rafts together to provide a larger target for search aeroplanes. The next 22 days became a classic survival saga. Eddie Rickenbacker, dressed in his traditional trademark grey fedora hat and business suit, took command of the situation, and although a civilian, such a strong-willed, independent thinker would not let military rank prevent him from stating what he thought and what decisions should be made. No one knew where to look for them when they were overdue at Canton Island. They nearly starved and had only a few oranges for liquid until they caught some rainwater during squalls. Eddie Rickenbacker took charge of doling out the oranges and water in equal shares each day. Eddie felt that his felt hat was used to catch the water, which was wrung out into a bucket from soaked articles of clothing. After the second week afloat, there were several frustrating days when the search planes flew nearby but failed to see them. It was decided after some wrangling that the 3 rafts could be allowed to drift apart in the hope that at least one might be seen. After 3 weeks, a search plane saw one of the rafts and the men were promptly picked up. Another raft drifted onto an uninhabited island where the occupants were found by a missionary who had a radio. Eddie Rickenbacker's raft was located by a Navy Catalina flying boat, and once more Captain Eddie Rickenbacker became front page news. He'd lost 60 pounds, had a bad sunburn and saltwater ulcers, and was barely alive. But the famous Rickenbacker luck had held, and the Boston Globe captioned the picture as the Great Indestructible. When it appeared that victory in World War II was on the horizon in late 1945, the airlines began to return to normal operations, and Eddie Rickenbacker encouraged Eastern's expansion and placed orders for Lockheed Constellations and Douglas DC-4s. These were followed by Martin 404s, Lockheed Electras, and the Cold War began with the Berlin airlift, followed by the Korean War, which forced more changes upon the airlines. The introduction of jets to airline operations in the late 1950s caused serious adjustment problems. Eddie Rickenbacker resisted the changeover to some extent. He later recalled, to keep up with the Joneses, we had to replace perfectly good piston-powered and turboprop airliners with the expensive new jets. He preferred that the other airlines be the first to take the risk of breaking them in. In 1953, Eddie Rickenbacker moved up to chairman of the board, but remained general manager. In his memoirs, he proudly stated that in his 25 years as head of Eastern, we were never in red ink. We always showed a profit, we never took a nickel of taxpayers' money in subsidy, and we paid our stockholders reasonable dividends over the years, and it was the first domestic airline to do so. I really hope you've enjoyed this brief look at Eddie Rickenbacker's life. It was just something that caught my eye when I was doing some of the much of the research that I do for various topics. I really hope you take care. Look forward to seeing you on the next film. All the very best. Cheers for now.